Have you ever felt like the farther you travel, the less peace you find? Like you're chasing stillness across mountains, temples, and quiet retreats, only to carry the same restlessness wherever you go. Today, we'll explore a beautiful paradox in Buddhism. Peace isn't something you have to find. It's something you remember the moment you finally stop searching. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why a wandering tourist found deep tranquility, not at the top of a mountain, but simply by sitting down. If that sparks your curiosity, stay with me and feel free to subscribe so we can walk this path together. I used to think my mind was broken. I didn't say it out loud, of course, but every time I sat still, tried to meditate, or even just breathe and be present, this voice inside me would start running fast without direction, like a wild dog chasing its tail. I'd sit on my cushion, close my eyes, and try to find some silence. But instead, my thoughts would shout louder. I should check my emails. Did I leave the stove on? What did she mean by that text? Oh no, I forgot to call mom. And just like that, I was 1,000 miles away from where I sat. I wasn't in the room anymore. I was in some chaotic world made of memories, fears, stories, expectations. And I hated it. I thought stillness meant silence. I thought meditation meant empty. I thought peace was something I could find if I just tried harder. But the harder I tried, the louder my thoughts got. It was maddening. And then one day, during a quiet evening, I came across a story, just a short Zen parable. A few lines only, but it changed me. A student once came to a Zen master and said, "My mind is restless. I can't stop thinking. I want peace." The master looked at him gently, then suddenly, without warning, slammed his hand down on the table. Bang! The student jumped. "That," said the master, "is your mind, always reaching, always stealing your peace. It's like a monkey swinging from branch to branch, never still, always grasping." The student, startled, asked, "But master, how do I stop it?" The master smiled. "You don't. You sit with it. You let it swing. Let it dance. Let it scream. Don't follow it. Don't feed it. Just watch, like clouds moving through the sky. Eventually, the monkey gets tired. It will settle beside you, in silence." That image, that one gentle truth, it broke something open inside me. I didn't have to fix my mind. I didn't have to control every thought. I didn't have to be a stone Buddha, unmoved by life. I just had to stop chasing the monkey. So I started over. I sat again, not to silence my mind, but to meet it. I imagined a forest, my forest, inside my mind. And in that forest, swinging from thought to thought, was my little monkey. Restless, curious, loud, playful, a little annoying, but also innocent, just being what it is. I watched it. One minute it was thinking about a childhood embarrassment. Next minute it was imagining worst-case scenarios. Then a song lyric. Then a random desire. It jumped from fear to fantasy to memory to doubt. But I didn't chase it. I didn't scold it. I just breathed. And slowly something beautiful happened. I felt a little space open up between me and the monkey. Just enough space to breathe. Just enough space to smile. The monkey was still there, but I wasn't it. And that changed everything. I think a lot of us go through life believing we are our thoughts. That if the mind is chaotic, we must be chaotic. If the mind is anxious, then we must be broken. But that's not the truth. The mind is just the mind. Thinks. That's what it does. Just like the lungs breathe. Just like the heart beats. You don't blame your lungs for breathing fast when you run. Why blame your mind for being busy in a busy world? We're surrounded by noise, notifications, responsibilities, expectations. No wonder the monkey is hyper. We've been feeding it sugar all day, news, opinions, gossip, worry, more worry, fear of missing out. But here's the miracle. Even with all that, peace is still possible. Because peace doesn't come when the monkey disappears. It comes when you learn to sit beside it. There's this quiet kind of friendship that can grow between you and your own mind. A gentle coexistence. Not one where you try to cage it, but one where you see it clearly. where you understand it, even love it, that's when meditation changes. It stops being a technique. It becomes a relationship, a loving, patient, forgiving relationship with yourself. I remember one morning, not long ago, I was sitting near the window, early light spilling across the floor like warm silk. Birds were singing. The kettle was quietly boiling in the kitchen. I closed my eyes, and immediately the monkey began. "You've got so much to do. Don't forget to respond to that email. Are you really making progress in your life? You're wasting time just sitting here." And for the first time, I smiled. I imagined the monkey saying all this while bouncing around, throwing bananas at me. And I said, silently, "It's okay. I hear you. You can swing. I'll just be here." And I was. And for a few moments, the monkey sat right beside me, still, quiet, watching the morning sun. That's the practice. Not fighting the mind, not fixing it, but befriending it. You don't have to be perfect to be peaceful. You just have to be present. Let the monkey jump. Let the thoughts pass. You sit like a mountain. Breathe like the ocean. Watch like the sky. Because deep down, beneath all that swinging, you are the stillness the monkey has been searching for all along. I used to believe that more was always better. More books, more courses, more advice, more planning, more effort, more doing. If I could just gather enough knowledge, enough tools, enough tips, I'd finally have it all figured out. I'd be wise, unshakable, whole. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel heavy, not wise, not free, just full. But not the good kind of full like after a warm bowl of soup. This was the kind of full that made me feel bloated with noise. Too many thoughts, too many voices in my head that weren't mine. It was during that time that I came across the story of the teacup. You may have heard it before. It's a classic Zen tale. But like most true things, it only really sank in when I was ready to hear it. There was once a student, eager, determined, a little anxious to prove himself, who visited a Zen master to ask for wisdom. The master welcomed him, sat him down, and offered him tea. The student kept talking about the books he'd read, the teachings he'd followed, his goals, his struggles, his search for something deeper. The master just nodded quietly and began to pour tea. The student didn't notice at first, but the tea kept flowing. It reached the brim of the cup. Then it spilled over, onto the saucer, then the table. Startled, the student cried out, "Stop! The cup is full." The master smiled. "Exactly," he said. "How can I pour anything into your cup when it is already full?" That story landed in my chest like a deep exhale. It was me. I was the cup, overflowing, not with presence, but with opinions, not with peace, but with clutter. Even my spiritual journey had become another thing to achieve. I wanted so badly to get it right that I forgot how to just be. That night, I sat down with a warm cup of tea in my own hands. The steam curled up into the air like incense, rising and disappearing. I held the cup and I asked myself softly, what am I filling my mind with right now? The answers surprised me. Worries, self-judgment, expectations, other people's voices, old stories I hadn't realized I was still carrying. So I did something simple. I imagined emptying the cup, not in a dramatic way, just gently pouring out what no longer served me. I didn't try to erase everything. I just invited space. And in that space, something returned. My breath, a quiet awareness, the taste of the tea in my mouth, the warmth in my hands, the sound of the night around me. I felt like I had come home. Here's what I've learned since then. In this world, we are taught to accumulate, to always be adding, collecting, doing. But the path of Zen, it's often a path of subtraction, letting go of what you don't need, emptying so that something deeper can enter. The cup doesn't lose its worth when it's empty. In fact, it's only useful because it's empty. Your mind is the same. Your heart is the same. You are not meant to hold everything. You are meant to hold what matters. And the beautiful thing is, you get to decide what that is. So when your mind feels overwhelmed, when peace feels far away, ask yourself, What am I holding right now? And gently, lovingly, begin to let go. Not everything at once, just a little at a time. Empty a single thought, a single fear, a single expectation, and sit with that space. Let it breathe, because in the silence that follows, something true begins to rise. Not noise, not information, but wisdom. The kind that doesn't come from books or gurus or long explanations. The kind that comes like the scent of jasmine on a summer evening. Soft, clear, and unmistakably real. So now, when I sit with tea, I remember that story. I don't just drink it, I become the cup. Not chasing fullness, but honoring emptiness. And in that quiet, simple ritual, the whole universe fits. Just like that. One breath, one sip, one present, empty cup. There was a time in my life when pain would come, and I'd make it worse. Not on purpose. Not because I wanted to suffer, but because no one had ever shown me that pain and suffering are not the same thing. It would start with something small, a disappointment, a loss, a harsh word, a plan that fell apart. And before I could even take a breath, I was drowning in the thoughts that came after. Why did this happen to me? What did I do wrong? This always happens. I should have known better. What if it never gets better? The pain would echo in my mind for days, weeks sometimes, not because the wound was deep, but because I kept scratching it open again. I thought I was processing it, but I was just reliving it, over and over. Then I heard a story, a short one from the Zen tradition. A master sat with his students and said this: when you are struck by an arrow, you feel pain. But what do you do next? You reach for another arrow and stab yourself again. The students looked confused. The master explained, the first arrow is the pain you didn't choose. The second arrow is the suffering you create by clinging to it. That stopped me in my tracks. I had never considered that so much of what I felt I was doing to myself. The breakup had already happened, but I kept replaying every word. The mistake had been made, but I kept punishing myself for it. The illness had come, but I added fear, resentment, shame on top of it. I was carrying so many second arrows, not because I was weak, but because no one had ever taught me how to let go. So I started practicing, not letting go of the pain, that would be dishonest, but letting go of the story I was building around the pain, the blame, the judgment, the questions with no answers. And what I found was that the first arrow hurt, but it healed. The second arrow, that's the one that leaves scars. I began to notice this in others too. A friend would fail at something and immediately start tearing themselves down. Someone would be rejected, and instead of grieving, they'd convince themselves they weren't worthy of love. A small embarrassment would spiral into shame, anxiety, avoidance. We're all so quick to add that second arrow. But what if we didn't? What if, when life pierces us, and it will, we took a breath and said, this hurts, that's okay, but I won't wound myself further. I remember a moment, not long ago, sitting in the stillness of the early morning. The house was quiet, the sky was barely glowing, and I felt the ache of something lost. Someone, actually. The grief rose, uninvited. But instead of running from it or analyzing it, I did something new. I placed my hand on my heart, and I whispered, just the first arrow, and I sat with the ache, not feeding it, not fighting it, just honoring it. And something miraculous happened. The pain softened, the space around it grew, and inside that space, there was tenderness, compassion, even peace. I began to see this teaching everywhere. In the way children cry and then move on. In the way animals shake off fear and return to the moment. In the way the wind rustles the leaves. It doesn't cling to any one tree. It just moves. So now, when pain comes, and it still does, I ask myself gently, am I holding the first arrow or the second? And if it's the second, can I lay it down? Can I breathe? Can I return to this moment? This precious, imperfect, unfolding moment without stabbing myself again? Sometimes that's the most compassionate thing we can do. Not fix everything, not make the pain disappear, but simply say, this hurts, but I will not hurt myself more. That is where healing begins. And maybe that's the real wisdom the Zen master was pointing to, not a life without arrows, but a heart wise enough to stop reaching for the second one. They say the wind speaks to those who are quiet enough to listen. I didn't used to believe that until I walked beneath the bamboo trees after a storm. It was the kind of morning where the world felt fresh, like it had just been washed clean by tears no one saw fall. The sky was heavy, still holding on to soft gray clouds. The air, damp and fragrant, carried the smell of rain-soaked earth. A Zen master and his student walked silently through a forest, each step cushioned by fallen leaves, their robes brushing softly against the undergrowth. The student, young and eager, broke the silence. "Master," he said, pointing ahead, "look at that bamboo. It bent so far in the wind, but it didn't break." The master smiled, the way someone does when they've been waiting for just the right question. "Yes," he said gently, "it bent, but did not break. That is strength." The student paused, taking in the scene. The bamboo swayed slightly, as if bowing to them in humility. "But isn't strength about standing tall, unmoved?" he asked. "Like a mountain?" The master knelt beside the bamboo and ran his fingers along its wet, flexible stalk. "No," he said softly. "Real strength is not about resistance. It's about resilience. Mountains stand still, but when the wind is strong enough, even they crumble. But bamboo, it yields. It dances, and in that dance, it survives." The student watched as a breeze passed through the grove, setting off a ripple of motion. The bamboo swayed in unison, not fighting, not resisting, just moving, alive. The master turned to him, eyes kind and steady. "In life," he said, "you will be tested. People will disappoint you. Grief will visit your doorstep. You will be misunderstood, even by those who claim to love you." He paused, letting those words settle like morning mist. "But you must be like this bamboo, not brittle, not hardened by anger, but soft enough to bend with compassion, strong enough to stay rooted, even when the wind howls." The student lowered his gaze, remembering how just days before, he had snapped at a friend words sharp and final, because he didn't know how to bend. He had mistaken being right for being strong. "Is it weakness to forgive?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The master's smile deepened, not just with his lips, but with his whole being. "No," he said, "it is the ultimate strength. Anger burns fast and hot, but compassion, true compassion, endures. It is the quiet power that heals, not just others, but yourself." They stood together in silence, the only sound the wind moving through the trees, as if nature itself were nodding in agreement. And in that silence, the student understood something not with his mind, but with his heart. Sometimes the world doesn't need us to be louder or tougher or more certain. Sometimes it just needs us to listen, to soften, to be willing to bend. Later, when they returned to the monastery, the student walked past the others with a new gentleness in his step. He saw a novice sweeping leaves and offered to help. He saw a bird with a broken wing and made a tiny nest of cloth to hold it. Not because he was told to, but because something inside him had shifted like bamboo, bending toward the light. And he understood now that compassion wasn't some lofty ideal reserved for saints or sages. It was something you lived moment by moment, choice by choice. Not loud, not showy, but real, soft, and strong, just like the bamboo. Have you ever had a day where your mind felt just full? Not with clarity, but with clutter. Like a room where every surface is stacked with old thoughts, half-finished worries, past conversations still echoing in your head? There was a time in my life when I was trying to learn everything. Every book, every idea, every teaching. I thought, if I just know enough, maybe I'll finally understand myself. Maybe I'll feel whole. But all I felt was tired, overwhelmed, like I was trying to drink from a cup that was already spilling over. One day, I remembered a story, simple but so quietly powerful. A young student once came to his Zen master with a question that had been burning in him for days. "Master," he asked, What is the meaning of life? The master didn't answer with words, not right away. Instead, he motioned for tea. He brought out 2 cups and a steaming pot. Slowly, mindfully, he poured into the student's cup. The tea reached the brim, and the master kept pouring. It spilled over the edges, puddling on the floor. The student, startled, said, "Master, stop! The cup is full." The master set down the teapot, his eyes calm. "Exactly," he said, "and so is your mind." That moment, that image, the overflowing cup, has stayed with me ever since. Because how often do we walk around like that? So full of our own beliefs, opinions, expectations, that nothing new can enter. No insight, no presence, no peace. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do for ourselves isn't to figure it all out, but to let go. Let go of what we think we know. Let go of the shoulds, the musts, the stories we've clung to for so long we've forgotten how to be without them. When the student looked into the master's eyes, something shifted. He realized it wasn't that he lacked answers. It was that he hadn't made space for them to arrive. "From now on," he said, bowing his head, "I will be more mindful of what I allow into my mind." The master nodded with quiet joy. "That," he said, "is wisdom. And I wonder, how often do we try to cram more into minds that are already overflowing? More information, more validation, more noise. But real learning, true transformation, happens in the quiet, in the pause between breaths, in the empty space where we finally put down the heavy bags we've been carrying and just listen, not to the outside world, but to the still, small voice within. There's a kind of sacred spaciousness that opens up when we dare to empty ourselves. Not in a way that makes us feel lacking, but in a way that invites light to pour in. Just like a cup emptied of old tea, ready to be filled with something warm and nourishing. So I ask you softly, what are you holding onto that no longer serves you? What thoughts are you sipping from every day, out of habit, that might be ready to be poured out? And what would it feel like, just for a moment, to be empty? Not lost, not hollow, but open, like a bowl held out to the sky, waiting to catch the first drops of rain. There is a quiet kind of power in that emptiness. A power born not from grasping or knowing, but from releasing, trusting, surrendering. In that space, compassion blossoms, not only for others, but for yourself. Because when the mind is empty, the heart finally has room to speak. And what it says in that silence is often the most healing sound of all. You know that feeling when life wears you down, not in a dramatic way, not like crashing thunder, but in that slow, silent way, like sandpaper to the soul. Tiny frictions, little heartbreaks, moments that chip away at you over time until, one day, you wonder, who am I now? I found myself asking that question once. It was during a particularly rough season. I had lost someone I loved, not through death, but through distance, that kind of invisible loss that leaves no funeral, but leaves you grieving all the same. My days felt heavy, my heart restless. I didn't know how to process what I was feeling, so I walked, just long, aimless walks along the beach, sometimes in the morning, sometimes after dark. I wasn't looking for answers, I was just trying to breathe. And one day, as I walked barefoot near the shoreline, my foot nudged something small. I bent down and saw it, a single smooth pebble. It was perfectly round, silky to the touch, softened by years of tide and time. And I remembered a story. A Zen student once walked along a beach with his master. As they wandered in silence, the student picked up a pebble, small, beautiful, worn smooth. "Master," he said, "this pebble is perfect." The master looked at it gently and replied, "Yes, but it took many years of waves and sand to make it that way." The student paused. That answer held something deeper than it seemed. In that moment, he realized maybe that's how the soul is shaped too. Not all at once, not through ease, but through the countless small pressures we face. The hard conversations, the quiet heartbreaks, the disappointments we survive, the losses that carve new space in us. We are worn down, yes, but also shaped, softened, made whole, not in spite of our experiences, but through them. That beach pebble became a metaphor for his life. And maybe for mine too, for yours. I still have that pebble I found that day. I keep it in my pocket when I travel. Some days I reach for it without even realizing. And the moment my fingers touch its surface, I remember, this is what transformation feels like. Not loud, not fast, but real. It's easy to believe that we should be finished by now, fully healed, fully figured out. But truth is, we're all still tumbling in the tide of life, still smoothing out the edges, still becoming. There is no rush. And just like that student, just like that pebble, we're allowed to take our time. In fact, the friction that wears us is also what refines us. Sometimes I think we forget that. We look at others who seem so put together, so serene, and we assume they've always been that way. But maybe, just maybe, their calm came at a cost. Maybe they too were once rough and sharp, tossed by waves we'll never see. And maybe your own struggles, the ones no one else knows about, are shaping something quietly beautiful in you right now. It doesn't mean the pain is easy. It never is. But it does mean it's not pointless. Because the storm that feels like it's wearing you down might be the same force that's revealing the smoother, wiser version of you. The one who doesn't react so quickly. The one who listens more deeply. The one who finds beauty in quiet things. So if today you feel rough, chipped, unfinished, I invite you to take a breath and imagine yourself as that pebble, softening, becoming, held in the ocean of this life, exactly where you need to be. And know this, you are not behind. You are becoming. Sometimes I sit quietly and watch my thoughts like I'd watch the wind move through tall grass, just noticing the way they sway, the direction they take, and how quickly they change. No judgment, just awareness. But it wasn't always like that. Years ago, I was caught in a storm of comparison. Maybe you've been there too. I'd scroll through my phone, see people smiling in photos, achieving things I hadn't, looking peaceful in their curated lives. And without even realizing it, I began to carry those images inside me, like little ghosts that haunted my sense of worth. One evening, after a particularly overwhelming day, I remembered a Zen story I once heard from an old friend who traveled through Japan in his youth. He told it so simply, over tea, his eyes soft with knowing. A Zen master once gathered his students and said to them, "The mind is like a mirror. It reflects everything placed before it." One of the younger students asked, "Then how can we control what it reflects?" The master smiled and gently shook his head. "You can't," he said, "but you can choose what you put in front of it." That line stayed with me. It was like something inside me paused, like the world quieted for just a second, and I realized the problem wasn't the mirror. It wasn't even the reflections. It was what I had been choosing to place in front of it. The master continued, "If you focus on darkness, your mind will reflect shadows. But if you place light before it, your mind will shine." There was no blame in his voice, just tenderness, compassion, like he understood how easy it is to forget this truth. And as I sat there that evening, with the hum of the world around me, I asked myself, what have I been placing in front of my mind? The expectations of others? The images of success that don't match my soul? The fears I inherited from people who meant well but didn't understand me? I realized I had the power, not to control the world, not to stop all the noise, but to be gentle with what I let in. So I began to choose differently. Instead of starting my mornings with social media, I opened a window and listened to the birds. I placed stillness in front of my mirror. Instead of holding on to criticism or replaying my failures, I'd recall a moment when someone looked at me with real love. I placed compassion there. Instead of staring at everything I thought was wrong with me, I started to notice the way my heart softened when I saw kindness in strangers, or how deeply I felt things, even if it hurt. I placed self-acceptance in front of my mirror. And you know what? Slowly, everything began to shift. My thoughts weren't as loud. My heart didn't feel as cluttered. And my reflection became clearer. Not perfect, not always peaceful, but more true. You see, the mind doesn't lie. It reflects. That's all it does. Like a lake that shows you the moon or the storm clouds. depending on the sky above it. And like the sky, what you focus on is always changing. So the question is, what are you placing before your mind? Is it love? Is it resentment? Is it fear? Is it gratitude? You don't have to force yourself to be positive all the time. Life isn't about pretending the storm doesn't exist, but it is about remembering that you don't have to stare at it forever. When we sit with awareness, when we treat our mind like a sacred mirror, we start to understand that we're not here to control everything. We're here to see clearly, to see kindly, to see what's real and what's just a passing shadow. And eventually, as the water of the mind becomes still, the mirror shows us something deeper, not just the world around us, but the light within us, a reflection not of who we were told to be, but of who we truly are. And maybe, just maybe, that's all we ever needed to remember. There's something about early morning in a temple garden. The way the mist hangs low like it doesn't want to leave. The smell of wet stone, of incense lingering from the night before. And then, just for a second, you see it, a dragonfly hovering above the surface of a pond. That was the exact moment a young monk found himself one summer morning, long before the bells rang. He wasn't looking for anything special. Just sitting, breathing, doing what the master had taught him. Don't chase thoughts, just notice them. Be still like a mountain lake. But on this morning, as the monk rested his hands gently on his lap, a dragonfly landed on his finger. It didn't move, and neither did he. Time seemed to pause. The dragonfly's wings shimmered like stained glass in the rising sun. Its body, so small and fragile, seemed to carry a stillness greater than the entire garden. The monk lowered his eyes, breathing slowly, sensing that this was no ordinary visit. He watched, not with the curiosity of a child, but with the quiet reverence of someone who knows when the universe is whispering. The dragonfly didn't flinch, didn't stir. It was utterly, completely present. And so was the monk. He noticed his breath, the warmth of the morning air, the stillness in his spine. No thoughts of the chores ahead. No clinging to yesterday's conversations. No inner dialogue telling him to label or define this moment. Just this, a shared stillness between two living beings. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to enter deeper. And in that silence, something happened. Not a vision, not a great flash of enlightenment. No thunderclap, no sudden realization. Just a deep, grounding peace. The kind that comes when you're no longer trying to become something. When you're no longer trying to be wise or calm or enlightened. You're simply here. And that was the dragonfly's lesson. When the monk opened his eyes again, the dragonfly had gone. It had lifted off in silence, as if it had only ever come to remind him of what he already knew. Presence is the doorway to truth. That day, he didn't tell the others what had happened. He didn't write it down in a journal. He just bowed quietly to the memory of the moment. Because some teachings don't come through words. They come through wings. Sometimes, what we seek in thick books and long meditations reveals itself in the smallest, most delicate gestures. A breath, a gaze, a whisper of wings on skin. And maybe, the stillness we chase so desperately is already here, hovering patiently, just waiting for us to notice. It asks nothing. It only invites. There's a kind of silence that grows in gardens, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. A silence shaped by the rhythm of wind through bamboo, by the rustle of leaves under bare feet, by the patient breath of the earth. And in the heart of such a garden lived a Zen gardener. He wasn't known for giving great talks. He rarely quoted sutras or gave long teachings. His robes were often dusty, his fingers always darkened by soil. But the way he pulled weeds, the way he knelt to tend to each plant, there was something holy in it. He didn't hurry. He didn't grumble. His care was meticulous, but never tense. Watching him work was like watching a poem slowly unfold. One day, a group of bandits passed near the edge of the forest. They were young, restless, and searching for easy prey. When they saw the humble gardener, alone and unarmed, they thought they had found it. They watched him for a while, confused. He didn't seem afraid. He wasn't even looking up, just trimming a low-hanging branch, humming a tune no one else could hear. As they stepped into the garden, he finally turned and smiled. Not a forced smile, not fearful or defensive, just warm, like the kind of smile you'd offer to a guest, not a threat. "You're welcome to sit," he said, gesturing toward a flat stone nearby. "But if you're here to take something, I must ask you to take all of it. Not just what's in my pocket." The bandits were stunned. "What do you mean?" He set his shears down and wiped his hands on his robe. "My garden, my breath, my years of care. If you want my money, you must take my life's work too, because they are the same." There was no pride in his voice, no drama, just truth. One of the younger bandits looked around. The garden wasn't rich, not in gold, not in jewels, but there was richness here, a stillness, care, a beauty that couldn't be taken, only cultivated. "Why?" the young one finally asked. "Why do you bother with all this?" The gardener smiled again. He bent down, lifted a small shoot of new green sprouting through the soil, and said softly, "Because it matters to me that something in this world is tended, even if no one sees it, even if it all fades tomorrow. I want to leave something behind that was touched with love." The wind shifted. The bamboo rustled gently, like applause only the trees could give. The bandits didn't speak. One by one, their faces softened. And then, almost shyly, they backed away. They didn't take the money. They didn't destroy the garden. They just left, quietly, thoughtfully, as if they'd stolen something far more valuable than coins. A glimpse into a life lived deliberately, with grace. The gardener didn't tell anyone what had happened. He didn't boast. He simply returned to his work, trimming the next branch, whispering again to the soil. Because that's the thing about real peace. It doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be rooted. And like any true garden, it grows one breath, one act of care at a time. It was a warm afternoon when a tourist arrived at a remote mountain temple, breathless and eager. His steps crunched softly on the gravel path as he looked around, eyes scanning for something, anything, that resembled what he imagined tranquility to be. He had traveled far. He had climbed the algorithmic mountains of Instagram feeds filled with sunsets and still waters, read the blog posts promising 10 steps to inner peace, watched influencers sip matcha lattes in silent retreats. And yet, something inside him still felt restless, aching. That's when he saw the monk, an elderly figure in a simple brown robe, sitting cross-legged under a blossoming plum tree, his hands resting gently on his knees, his breath moving slowly like the wind through the petals. The tourist approached, slightly embarrassed, but curious enough to ask, "Excuse me, I'm looking for a place of peace, of tranquility. Can you help me?" The monk didn't open his eyes. He just nodded and replied, gently, "Yes, just be here, now." The tourist blinked. "But where do I need to go? Is there a special garden, or a path I should walk?" The monk opened his eyes this time, not with impatience, but with a quiet smile that felt like a warm towel placed on your hands in winter. "You don't need to go anywhere," he said. "The peace you're searching for, it's already here. It always has been. But you are always somewhere else." The tourist fell silent, and then he sat down. No grand ceremony, no gong, no incense, just two humans, one with a head full of questions, the other with a heart full of stillness, sitting side by side beneath a tree. At first, the silence made the tourist squirm. He checked his watch, adjusted his camera strap, wondered if he was doing it right. But after a while, something shifted. His breathing slowed. The chatter in his head softened. He heard the rustling of leaves like a lullaby. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, he didn't feel like he needed to be somewhere else. He just was. And in that moment, something within him unclenched. The monk glanced at him and said softly, "When you chase peace like a destination, it stays just out of reach. But when you stop chasing, it sits beside you like an old friend." The tourist smiled, not because he had figured it all out, but because maybe, for the first time, he realized he didn't have to. You know, in today's world, we're all a bit like that tourist, always looking, scrolling, clicking. We book retreats, take courses, rearrange our homes for feng shui, but peace isn't a product. It's not tucked away behind a paywall or buried in a digital detox retreat. It's in the way we sip our coffee in the morning without rushing, in how we look at a child's drawing and smile instead of correcting it, in the way we let someone speak without interrupting, not to reply but to truly listen. Compassion, too, begins in that kind of presence. I once saw a mother in a grocery store, overwhelmed, her toddler crying, and another shopper muttering behind her in frustration. The tension in the air was thick. But then, a woman nearby stepped forward, not with judgment, but with kindness. She crouched down, smiled at the child and said, "Hey there, that's a big feeling you've got today." And just like that, everything softened. No magic, just a moment of being present with another human being. That's what compassion looks like. That's what peace feels like. And it doesn't take robes or temples, just attention. The truth is, most of us live like tourists in our own lives, rushing through moments, collecting experiences like souvenirs, thinking peace is something we'll find when we finally get there. But Zen gently whispers, there is no there. There is only here. When we can sit with ourselves, even in discomfort, even in confusion, without needing to escape, something begins to settle. When we can sit with others, even in their messiness, without needing to fix or judge, something begins to heal. And when we do this again and again, like the monk under the tree, we don't just visit peace. We become it. The monk was sitting quietly, legs folded like the petals of a lotus, as the sun poured through the misty mountain trees, warm, soft, golden. The air was still, broken only by the sound of his breath and the faint rustling of wind through pine needles. His eyes were closed, not in rejection of the world, but in complete union with it. Then came hurried footsteps, crunching gravel. A tourist, red-faced, out of breath, camera around his neck, maps and brochures sticking out from every pocket like forgotten intentions. He stopped just short of the monk and blurted out, "Excuse me, I'm looking for a place of peace and tranquility. Can you help me find it?" The monk opened his eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream he'd never left. He looked at the tourist, not with judgment, but with that kind of gentle recognition we sometimes feel when we see someone else chasing the same thing we once did. "Yes," the monk said with a small smile. "I can help you." The tourist, relieved, pulled out his phone. "Great. Could you maybe mark it on a map?" The monk chuckled softly, almost like the sound of leaves falling on water. "No need," he said, his voice like still water. "Just be here, now." The tourist looked around, confused. "But where is here?" The monk raised a single hand and placed it over his heart. "Here," he whispered. "And here," he added, touching the earth beside him. The tourist blinked. "I think I don't understand." "You don't need to go anywhere," the monk said. "Peace and tranquility are already here. You just haven't sat still long enough to feel them." The words hovered in the air like incense smoke, wrapping around the tourist's mind. He looked down at his restless hands, then to the monk's steady breath. He hesitated, then slowly, awkwardly he sat. No bells, no chants, no secret initiation. Just two human beings breathing under the same sky. At first, the tourist fidgeted. The silence pressed in like a weight. He could feel the buzz of emails left unanswered, the ticking of clocks he always obeyed. But then something cracked, something subtle. A small thread of stillness wove through him. His breath slowed, his shoulders softened, his eyes closed, and he listened to the breeze, to his heartbeat, to the way his body sat on the earth as if it had always belonged there. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had stopped playing its usual tricks. When he finally opened his eyes again, something was different. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He turned to the monk, tears barely hidden in the corners of his eyes. "I've been searching everywhere," he whispered, "but I didn't realize it was already inside me." The monk smiled. "You never left it," he said gently. "Only forgot. Isn't that what many of us do? We travel miles to temples and retreats, buy meditation apps and silence retreats, thinking we must go somewhere to feel peace. We imagine tranquility like a destination, marked by coordinates or granted by gurus. But maybe peace isn't found. Maybe it's remembered, in the middle of modern life with its honking horns, flashing screens, overflowing calendars. We forget that underneath it all, we still have access to that same stillness. It's like a song playing faintly beneath the noise, but we have to be still enough to hear it. I think about my own life, about the time I once sat alone in a hospital hallway, heart heavy from bad news, waiting for a doctor. I didn't know what to do, so I just closed my eyes, took a breath, then another. And in that breath, despite the beeping machines, the smell of antiseptic, the uncertainty, I felt a quiet space open inside me. It didn't fix everything, but it held me, and in that moment it was enough. Just like the monk said, you don't have to go anywhere. The peace you're searching for has been quietly waiting in you. Maybe it's time to stop searching for a place and simply start being in this one. Right here, right now, with yourself. Are you willing to sit still long enough to remember? Sometimes we think we need to climb higher to touch the sky. But the truth? The sky has always been there. We just needed to be still enough to notice. Peace doesn't arrive when your thoughts disappear. It arrives when you can sit beside them, like a quiet friend, without needing to fix or follow them. As the monk said, you don't have to go anywhere. The peace you're seeking is already here. So let me ask you, have you had a moment lately where you felt truly present, even just for a breath? Share it with me in the comments. I'd love to know. And if this message touched you, consider subscribing, not just to a channel, but to a journey back home to yourself.